Hello and welcome to Calm the Farm podcast, where pharmacy business meets legal wisdom, minus the headache. In each episode, we share practical legal tips and real-life examples to help you run your pharmacy with confidence. I'm your host, Sarah Stoddart. Thanks very much for joining us. In today's episode of Calm the Farm, we're talking about stock takes. Now, this is an interesting one because pharmacy businesses have a somewhat unique way of conducting stock takes. Importantly, as a bit of a disclaimer on this one, if you are transacting, it is important that you consider the circumstances of your transaction and if you're already in a contract, the terms of that contract. But I wanted to talk through broadly what's involved in a pharmacy stock take from a legal perspective. So normally, at the time of entering into a contract or making an offer, the parties have agreed to a stock level. The first thing that's important with your stock level is whether it is exclusive or inclusive of the purchase price. So oftentimes people tell me a price for a pharmacy and I then need to ask whether or not that is inclusive or exclusive of stock. So important to make it clear what your stock figure is, and I would always recommend doing that separately to your purchase price. For example, and I'm not a numbers person, if your pharmacy is $1 million and your stock is $100,000, you should say $1 million plus stock of $100,000. That's the first thing. The second thing is whether or not that stock figure is a maximum figure or an estimated figure. And this does often trip people up. Your views on this can also depend on whether you're on the seller's side or the buyer's side. So where you have an estimated stock figure, that's usually based on the average stock on hand in the business. So if your stock level's usually around 100K, and as I say, I'm not a numbers person, so I'm just going to use easy numbers, then that might be the estimated figure. But when settlement and stock take rolls around, it might be that the stock is 92,000 or it might be 108,000, and then the buyer pays for whatever stock is there based on the estimate. If the stock is a maximum, that means that the buyer will not pay for stock above the certain amount. So if you set a maximum stock figure of $100,000 and stock figure is 102, then the parties have to work out what of the stock to exclude to reduce the stock figure from 102 back to 100,000. Now, sometimes how that process is conducted is set out in the contract, and we might get to that shortly. The other important thing to note in relation to estimate and maximum duty is that stock, particularly in a state like Queensland, is subject to stamp duty. So that means that purchasers in Queensland are paying stamp duty on stock. Now, if your contract has a maximum stock figure, that is the amount on which you will pay stamp duty irrespective of the actual stock figure. So if you put a maximum amount of 100,000 and the stock comes in at 92,000, you'll still pay duty on 100,000. So it is for this reason that we always try to express stock as an estimate so that if we're acting for a buyer, it doesn't impact on their duty. For a seller, it might be a little bit different. The other thing to think about when deciding your stock clause is the expiry dates. Sometimes it's stock that has an expiry date of 3 months or less from the settlement date. Sometimes it's 4 months, sometimes it's 6 months. So you need to think about that. Damaged stock is also often excluded, or stock that is unable to be sold for whatever reason. You might also think about high-cost drugs, particularly if you're a buyer, and where those are going to fit into the stock equation. Other things that are relevant and become more relevant depending on the type of pharmacy or the time of year is gift lines. So, for example, if you're transacting around or just after Christmas, you may want Christmas stock excluded because it becomes difficult to sell after that festive season is over. Similarly, the same applies around Mother's Day and Father's Day, particularly when there's higher amounts of fragrance and the like. So thinking about what time of year you're transacting or may transact and whether there needs to be any carve-outs for that. Now, when it comes to the actual special condition regarding stock, you should, of course, take advice from your legal representative. But we do see a bit of a process play out commonly in pharmacy, and that is that in terms of the actual stock take itself, either a third party stock taker is appointed to conduct the stock take, usually on the day before the completion date, or the parties might decide, particularly if it's a small pharmacy, to conduct the stock take themselves based on the point of sale system and perhaps even some spot checks. So that's another decision that has to be made. You then also have to decide how any disputes are going to be resolved. So if a party doesn't agree with a stock figure that is determined, how long have they got to raise an issue with that? Who is going to determine the actual final stock figure in light of any disputes, and how long has that person got to make that determination? That's another decision that has to be made. Flowing on from that, you also should think about how much is going to be paid for stock at settlement. Now, typically, there is an amount paid to the seller, an amount withheld in a trust account. So, for example, if the stock amount is $100,000, it may be that $80,000 is paid to the seller and $20,000 is held in the seller's solicitor's trust account. The reason for that is because oftentimes the final stock amount is not known at settlement and is still being determined or agreed. So we release a significant proportion of the amount to the actual seller, hold the balance in trust, and then when the stock amount is actually determined, the amount in trust gets released. So if we did that, paid 80 to the seller and 20 in trust, and the stock figure came in at 98,000 of the 100,000 estimate, we would then release a further 18,000 to the seller and refund 2,000 to the buyer. So that is a decision that has to be made. Another decision that has to be made is how excess stock is going to be dealt with. Now, this is a tricky one, particularly if your excess stock is medicines. When dealing with excess stock, there's a couple of options. One, the buyer can be forced to purchase the excess stock, so that if stock comes in at 102, as I mentioned earlier, the buyer must purchase the additional $2,000 worth of stock. There might be the option to purchase excess stock up to a certain percentage. So, for example, 10% of excess stock they'll buy, and after that they won't. There might be, number two, a buyer may have the option to elect to purchase excess stock at their choice. So if stock is 102, the buyer says, yes, I'll purchase the extra 2,000, or they might say, I'll take an extra 1,000. That's at their election. Or thirdly, it may be that any excess stock is to be removed by the seller. Now, if you are a seller and you're considering this, usually we wouldn't recommend that the seller agree to take any excess stock unless you have another pharmacy to move it to. Otherwise, you're potentially left holding a heap of stock. If there is stock concerns as well, particularly around medicines, it's important to consider how those will be dealt with, because you can't just take them out of a pharmacy business. So that's also a consideration. If the option to purchase the excess stock is taken by the buyer, the contract might also set out when that is to be paid for. Is that to be paid for within 7 days of settlement, 3 months of settlement? Does it attract interest or not? When you are dealing with a stock clause, it's often not the case at all that just the standard stock condition in the contract is adopted. Usually stock is dealt with via a special condition, and that's because there are plenty of considerations. It is important to think through those considerations, take into account the various factors that we've discussed to make sure your stock clause is appropriately drafted for your transaction, the location of your pharmacy, the time of year in which you're transacting, and the circumstances of the transaction more broadly. I hope that's been helpful. As always, I'd appreciate your feedback and look forward to talking to you again next week.